This program contains candid discussion of gender identity and may include adult topics and language. Listener discretion is advised. This episode of Trans Chat with Christiana is being brought to you by True Voice Lessons, LLC. Offering the finest in online and in-person voice and music instruction, True Voice Lessons has what you're looking for. Transgender voice training, singing, piano, guitar, and much, much more. Let our highly qualified staff of instructors help you achieve your goals. TrueVoiceLessons.com. Unlock your true voice today.
Trans Chat with Christiana. Real people, real lives, real talk. Trans Chat with Christiana.
Hi, and welcome to Trans Chat. Real people, real lives, real talk. I'm your host, Christiana Brecky. On this week's episode, I'm excited to have a chat with my friend Eva Detten. We'll talk about her trans journey and her work as a high school teacher. I was a high school teacher for 3 years. It was quite possibly the worst 3 years of my life. I was the choir director and I also taught guitar. I was in way over my head in terms of both education and experience. I had a bachelor's degree in English, not music. I could barely read music. And while I sang in various choirs in high school and college, I had never directed one before. In today's vernacular, I was way out of my lane. Hell, I wasn't even on the highway. Even if I hadn't been so far out of my league, I just wasn't a very good school teacher. It wasn't a problem with my students. They liked me for the most part because I was really lax. I'd let them get away with pretty much anything. There was this kid who always showed up to class after lunch stoned. After a few times, I confronted him, and he was like, "Please don't narc me out. It's the only way I can tolerate this fucking school." I couldn't really argue with that. If I hadn't been subject to random drug screening, I would have spent my lunchtimes getting high too. Sure, I should have turned him in. As a teacher and employee of the school district, I'm sure it was my obligation to do so. But instead, I just kept Altoids in my office for the kid. For the administration and my fellow teachers, my slipshod teaching was a bit more of a problem. I had poor classroom management, students coming and going as they pleased. My new guitar classes attracted non-band riffraff to the band annex, which infuriated the band directors. And my classes were dumping grounds for counselors to unload students for whom there were no other elective classes available at the time. Half of my students had no real interest in singing at all, or learning the guitar. It didn't help matters that I was still deep in the throes of my gender dysphoria. Ignorant, without even the tiniest inkling that I was suffering from a medical condition. That there was an explanation for why I had always felt in my heart like I was a woman. I saw no hope for happiness in my future. I was a crappy teacher because I didn't care. Trying to deal with being trans when I didn't even know what it was. I didn't care if I lived or died. I had a lot of depression. I drank heavily and often. I overate incessantly, and at my heaviest, I weighed about 350 pounds. I've wondered a time or two if I was in that same job, at the same school, at the same time, but able to live authentically to my gender identity as I do now, might the outcome have been any different? Would my newfound sense of confidence and body gender alignment have somehow translated to better classroom management? Perhaps. But as emotional as I am now, and how stoic I used to be back then, I may be even less effective. I think I'll just leave school teaching to the experts. Real people, real lives, real talk.
Trans Chat with Christiana.
This week's guest on the podcast is Eva Detten. Eva, thanks so much for being here. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Christy.
Let's get to it. When did you realize you were trans?
So I had internalized transphobia, which I should probably clarify a little bit. Like, I've always been an ally for trans people. I just never, saw it fitting me. You know, you hear internalized transphobia and you're like, you hear the transphobia part and people are like, oh, this person hated trans people, blah, blah, blah. No, I had trans friends and everything. But as far as, how it would apply to me, I didn't really see that. And I kind of hid it from myself, push back against everything from. I was kind of, at certain points, pretty hyper-masculine. I got more comfortable with some of my quirks and things like that later on, but I still didn't actually realize I was trans until November 13th of last year.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So when you realized you were trans, did you immediately decide to come out and transition?
So at the time, I was actually teaching in Phoenix, Arizona. I had 7th graders, and I'm currently in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is where I was born and raised. When I came out to myself, I put in my notice. And 3 weeks later, I moved back to Cincinnati and started transitioning. But there was that weird 3-week period. My toenails were painted and stuff. But there was that awkward 3-week period of okay, so I know I'm this, but I'm not this yet.
Yeah.
Where I still identified. I think when I came back to Cincy, I went out with my best friend once. We had some drinks so he could have, throw back one more beer with Dave, that kind of thing. And then I started transitioning the next day.
You mentioned friends. How about your family? How did they take the news?
My family has largely been supportive. I'm living there right now.
Nice.
Teaching while you're transitioning, just especially middle school or high school, probably a challenge.
Yeah.
The kids are very tolerant, actually. It's the parents that I'm more concerned about in administration.
Yeah.
Those are really where my concerns lie. But yeah, no, I've had really good family support. My sister was this is so awesome. What kind of dress can I buy you?
Yeah.
My parents kind of had to ease into it a little bit. My mom was definitely worried about safety at first, but
yeah.
So we had to have some conversations. We watched some I Am Jazz, hey, how did this relate to you? And blah, blah, blah.
Right.
So that's kind of how that went down with my immediate family. My relatives were largely supportive. Some of them needed a little bit more conversation than others. But I didn't have anyone write me off or anything like that. So I've been very fortunate that I've had pretty good and privileged that I've had pretty good family support with my transition.
Nice. So are you on HRT?
Yes.
And how's that been going for you so far?
Pretty good. When I started HRT, it was in March. So it was right when everything was going down. I'm in my mid-30s, so my hairline was receding and I was starting to get really... So I want to get on this now. Well, this COVID thing is happening. Let me get this going, get this in my system. It's actually been for me pretty... And I've seen different people react very differently. But for me, it's kind of calmed my anxiety a lot. Give me a lot of confidence. If anything, now I'm kind of worried about having too much of an ego. Before I was pretty anxious and insecure, and so it's kind of weird going from one to the other, and I'm trying to make sure I don't hit that extreme. I don't want to be a megalomaniac or anything like that. So yeah, that's been how that's been for the most part for me. Losing my strength was a little weird. In the past 2 months, I was a weightlifter in my dead life. And you definitely feel pretty vulnerable when you're shedding muscle mass. But yeah, beyond that, my experiences with HRT so far have been very positive.
Awesome. Yeah, I can attest to the loss of physical strength. Things I could muscle around pretty easily back in the day have become much heavier and harder to deal with.
Yeah.
So it sounds like your transition has been pretty smooth so far.
I've been very fortunate and privileged, and I know a lot of people who haven't, but I've been pretty lucky in most, capacities.
You've been in geographical locations where it's been relatively easy to access, like therapists and trans healthcare.
I never, so we have, in Cincinnati and in Ohio in general, we have what's called Equitas Health, and they're great. They cater specifically to LGBT people, and
Oh, wow.
more specifically, they're very trans accessible. So
Nice.
I started the Cincinnati one 2 days after they opened. So I was one of their first patients, and they've been absolutely wonderful with me. So I've been,
Awesome.
kind of fortunate in that capacity too.
Awesome.
Mental health care. I went to a therapist for a little bit. I'm kind of a talker, and I'm very good at solving my own problems and keeping them to myself. So usually therapy just turns into like a BS session for me where we just chat for a while and laugh.
Yeah.
So I've never been very good at therapy. Like, I'm just a bad student there. But, I definitely think that that's probably advisable for most people.
Well, if you think about it, if you were going to therapy and coming out happy and laughing, then perhaps it was therapeutic,
Hey, maybe it was.
at least on some
I
level.
guess so, yeah. I did it because my parents really kind of insisted that I do it, but I'm very I don't know. It works well for most people, so I don't want to jade anybody that might be listening to oh, I don't need a therapist. Ava's doing great.
Yeah.
That's a very niche me thing. It's not most people. I would not recommend that to almost anybody.
Yeah, I have sort of a similar situation. I didn't initially seek out any counseling because I was 100% certain that I was trans, based on all the reading and research that I'd done. I didn't feel like I needed any verification or validation. And luckily, things, have advanced in recent years where we don't have to jump through as many hoops as we used to. And it's great that young people are better informed and getting to transition sooner in life.
Yeah, to get the HRT.
So what advice would you give to someone who was just starting out on their trans journey?
Make it yours. Everybody's different. Everybody has different needs, different expectations, different, you're all working with different clay and fabric. Because of my job and things like that, passing's kind of important. But, if it wasn't for that, I probably would have to reassess things. But there are times where I like to go out with my friends and look trans. I don't want to pass. I want to look like a trans woman. I want to be a little ostentatious. I want to be a little bit over the top. So, everybody's different. Everybody's transition's different. Definitely do some reflection, probably some counseling, know where you want to take it, kind of as much as possible, have a plan. But I would say the cool thing about transitioning is it's kind of punk rock. It's kind of anarchic. It's yours. Make it yours.
Awesome. Great advice. So you mentioned it, that it was important that you pass at work. Tell us a little bit about what you do.
So I'm a high school teacher. I've been teaching for about 6 years. I was in Arizona for most of it, but I was actually kind of close to you for a little bit. I was in McAllen, Texas.
Oh, yeah?
For about 6 or 7 months too. Yeah. So I have Texas teaching certification, Arizona teaching certification, and mostly social studies, but I also am certified in English. And I created an ethical philosophy curriculum too for high school kids, which was super fun.
Nice.
Which I taught 1 year. But yeah, I love teaching. I want to get back to the classroom, but yes, being transgender, definitely, there's always, the stigmas like child molester or things like that associated with, that's always I think even going back to the 1930s, there was someone who was non-gender conforming, they didn't really know how to define it or anything like that back then, but they pinned some sort of child molestation on that person because they assumed that there was a connection between the two. And it's dealing with that kind of stigma. I was the safest person ever in a classroom when I was especially closeted, but even, always.
Right.
But there's that stigma you have to deal with. Your school is only as liberal as like the most conservative families because they're going to complain.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a thing, and I'm not sure whether I'm employable or not as far as that's concerned. I do know of, like, really anecdotally, not personally, but I do know of some trans people who teach. But it's definitely going to be a challenge, and as far as where I live and stuff like that, I'm probably going to have to be kind of flexible. So there's definitely, some ways in which transitioning is going to affect my professional life.
Yeah. I taught high school choir for 3 years, so I definitely understand the nature of school politics. As a teacher, have you seen any sort of resistance or like anything you would consider to be anti-trans?
Yeah, so, and I'm not going to name the schools, or I'm going to keep everything pretty confidential and things like that.
Sure.
But at one of the schools that I was at, I moderated student government. And even though I was still, dealing with internalized transphobia, I had no idea. For some reason, a lot of the kids that congregated to me were gender nonconforming. Like, a lot of them identify particularly as non-binary today. I had one who identified as trans male. Now, currently, they identify as non-binary, but their senior year, they identified as trans male and ran for homecoming king.
Oh.
And I was the moderator for student government, so I handled the election and everything like that. And the students voted for this kiddo to be homecoming king. And for whatever reason, well, I know why, very conservative leaning, it didn't sit very well with the principal. So we had some conversations about this. I ended up on his bad side about this. So he started, provoking me and probing me with that and things like that.
Wow.
So we had verbal altercations. It almost turned physical, which would have ended very poorly for me because even though I was pretty fit, this guy was a former, baseball player, minor league baseball player, 6'6", probably 240, 250.
Yeah.
I didn't stand a chance, but this almost even turned physical. It was bad.
Wow.
So I transferred to a different school same year. I kept in contact, and I'm still in contact with Newt, my kiddo. And they, at graduation, and this is probably the most punk rock story, and this kid deserves so much props for this. When they were graduating, they had a picture of me, saying my favorite line on their, they can paint their graduation hats and things like that. So they had a painting of me on their graduation hat, and me saying my signature line, just to annoy the principal. We all graduated together. It's all the kids from my charter district got together for one big graduation. So I was there too, at my new school. And they refused to shake the principal's hand when they got their diploma.
Oh.
No, I talked to the kiddo. I'm graduation's for your parents. What are they going to think about it? Because they bounced it off me first and things like that. And they're like, oh, they hate him. And I'm like, okay, go for it. Do it up. It'll be awesome. So that's also, by the way, the first person I came out to on November 14th of last year.
Oh, wow.
Was my former student. So
nice.
Newt's my adopted child.
Yeah.
So they're someone that's very important to me. And we keep in contact. They made me a stuffed animal and everything. So
nice.
Yeah, that's transition in the classroom as far as that's concerned. It's definitely, it's a lot better than it would have been had I done it back when I was in high school, for sure. I had trans kids who, teachers respected their pronouns.
Yeah.
My NBs, for whatever reason, never really approached, I would have respected that, but for whatever reason, I guess I was just intimidating or something. I don't know. But, they never came to me with that. But, I've had other trans kids, and by and large, at least from what I heard, wasn't in their shoes. The teachers were pretty respectful, but we did have one bad principal. And the kids were great too. For their senior prank, they brought to their graduation. They didn't do one during school. They waited till graduation. Brought rainbow duct tape. And all the kids from the PV campus that I was at decked themselves out in rainbow duct tape. So It was really cute.
Oh,
I really appreciated the
how
the sentiment
awesome.
there.
Yeah, my goodness.
So,
That made me feel so special. How awesome.
yeah.
That's so cool. Well, so what happened with the homecoming king?
So the principal wanted a revote. I refused to manage it. So he had and was willing to go around to all the classrooms, collect the ballots, count them up in some sort of, rigged election. Um,
Wow.
so,
Wow.
yeah.
So someone else ended up getting the title after all then,
They
right?
refused to allow, they refused to allow this child to be on the ballot for
Oh,
this ballot.
wow.
This principal was an asshole. He hired his wife to be a long-term sub to replace me.
Oh, wow.
And the kids pretty much revolted on her and just like ran amok. Like it was a mess. Let's see. And she played like Fox News clips like it was like gospel or something in class,
Yeah.
which I'm to the left, but I know my bias, so like I don't play like CNN or things like that in the classroom. Like
Yeah, I
I
mean
try to pick.
that's just
But
inappropriate no matter what side you're on.
yeah, so that's the kind of person this was. He's no longer there torturing children, so
Well, at least for that.
yeah, we've escaped that situation.
And I'm sure you made a difference. So hopefully, the next time a trans boy is voted homecoming king, he'll get the title.
As well he should, yeah. And I
Absolutely.
still keep in contact with a lot of the kids. That kiddo was the first person I talked to. That same night I talked to Ariel, another one of my former students who used to like run with me because we were both dealing with the fact that I had to transfer and stuff like that. So we used to run together after school on Wednesday. So really cool.
During the Obama administration, the Department of Education released a set of guidelines for the schools with regard to trans students, restrooms, locker rooms, and so on. Of course, when Trump took office, everything with Obama's name tagged to it was immediately abolished. In your school, did you see any issues or friction in that area?
I'm going to be honest, I never really got into that dialogue. So I did not have too much, interaction with that. That probably would have been handled more on the administrative level. I never had a conversation about that with the kid because at that point I didn't know that I was trans either.
Gotcha.
I was still presenting male. I assumed I was a straight cisgender male at the time. So, it wasn't something that I was super familiar with either. I think. So my personal opinion is that's an issue of exposure. It's an issue of people listening to each other and understanding where they come from. Because, there's just so many social stigmas that have been reinforced over time. And, as a history person, if you look back in history, you can see, the gender roles being, in Western culture and things like that, the influences of, different religions on it and things like that, and how it kind of evolved from there. So I think a lot of it has to do with exposure. So you're doing exactly what needs to happen right now because those parents need to buy into the idea that trans women are trans women and trans men are trans men. Not boys in skirts or girls in jeans.
Right.
It's a matter of getting them on board with that. It's a matter of reshaping culture. I don't think there's a way you can have that conversation because they're gonna just shut you down with boy in dress, girl in jeans. Like that's
chromosomes,
where you're gonna get,
chromosomes, baby.
Yeah. Just getting past the biological sex being totally independent of gender identity. Well, not totally independent, but they're different things. So
you're right. Yeah, that's something people don't seem to realize. It's a common misconception. I mean, people are still confused about gender identity versus sexual orientation.
Yeah.
Sometimes it seems like things are improving, but other times, I don't know. What do you think? Do you think that we're sort of starting to turn the corner in our culture with regard to knowledge and acceptance?
Oh, definitely. So I have anecdotally, I have like a pretty good story for you. So I have an aunt who lives in rural Ohio, and this town's very conservative by and large. And she's disabled, so she watches a lot of TV and stuff like that. Well, my mom was going around like calling people to like, talk to them about my gender identity changing and things like that. And, mom's going down the list and I see Aunt Irma there and I'm like, oh, good luck. Mom calls Aunt Irma and Aunt Irma was like, oh, I've watched every single episode of I Am Jazz. This is like my second week transitioning. So like at this point, my aunt knows more about being trans than I. Like it's really funny. So things like that like break in. And as a history teacher, one thing that I recognize and I taught my kids is when people push for civil rights and things like that, W.E.B. Du Bois was pretty awesome. He had great ideas, but he wasn't infiltrating the average person's living room or anything like that. You needed you needed the Jackie Robinsons, you needed the Ella Fitzgeralds, you needed entertainers, athletes, people that are more visible in public. That's what you need. And I think if we want to fix the whole bathroom situation and things like that, which is a situation for sure, rather than trying to hit our heads up against it's more positive exposure. When I do things, I'm very conscious, like when I go out and eat or things like that. At this point I pass. But like when I don't, or when I didn't, or sometimes I make it known that I'm trans or something, I tip really well because I want people to have good positive associations. But it kind of sucks because now I have this pressure on me that's like I have to be like a perfect angel every time I go out now because I'm representing a whole group of people.
You better behave yourself.
So, yeah, like I can't be a bitch now. This sucks. But getting people in culture, exposure and things like that, I think is really important. So I'm trying to do what I can to further that on my end. Like, I'm not and I'm probably a little too old to be a super celebrity or anything like that. But, I try to, I talk to people, I have conversations. My Facebook is very openly trans, and I will talk to people and engage in dialogue, not you're wrong. Like, hey, this is where I'm coming from. Like, it's a really real place. Like, in my dead life, I couldn't flirt. I couldn't dance. I couldn't sing. I always felt subconscious. I was always overcompensating for things. So, on some level, I was pretty miserable. And I had some success in some areas, and I was able to have some semblance of a normal, I was married, had a job, had a house, all that kind of stuff. But I never felt comfortable in my own skin, and it was very real. And now that I look back at it, I can see even back to childhood, I tried ballet and things like that. The parents actually, apparently made fun of me when I was 4 or 5 and I didn't go back. So
that's so sad.
Yeah, there's stuff that goes all the way back. It's always been there. It's not just one day I woke up and I'm like, hey, wouldn't it be sweet if I were a girl?
Yeah.
It's not like that at all. It's coming from a very real place. It's coming from a lot of pain and suffering. I'm happier this way despite the discrimination and all the BS I have to deal with.
Right.
But yeah.
Similarly to the restroom debates in schools, I'm starting to see trans athletes, particularly trans girls, become the new anti-trans political scare tactic. It's an election year, so, we get to see all this stuff. But I have to admit that I wonder if maybe there's a little validity to this argument. I was quite big before, and even though I've lost a lot of my muscle mass, I'm still pretty formidable. If I were to physically challenge a cisgender woman who was my size and my weight, I could be wrong, but I feel like I would still have the advantage. What are your thoughts on this?
That's a hot button issue. And yeah, I thought of doing a girls softball league this year, and because I like to play, I'm in my mid to late 30s, but I still am pretty active and love to play sports and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I thought about doing it, but I'm like, I really am at a competitive advantage here.
But, it should be like a case by case thing, because if a trans girl starts on hormone blockers early enough, she won't experience the effects of male puberty, including size and muscle mass, and would therefore have no biological advantage over her cisgender competitors.
Yeah, if she's never had male puberty, from everything I've read, there's not a problem with that. But I do, and I don't know exactly what to do, because, like, I think then, like, oh, you could have, like, queer leagues or things like that or whatever in sports, but then there's a whole, that's a whole thing too, the separate but
segregation.
Separate but equal, like it's like a whole thing. So, like, but there is, like, biological sex there definitely plays a role. It's not just gender identity at that point. It definitely makes a huge difference. And again, it also kind of underscores the fact that, it's not just in our heads or anything like that. Like, to give away that kind of muscle and things like that, to voluntarily give that away, and male privilege and all that, which is very real.
Yes.
Let's be honest, it's very real. Like, to give all that away, there's something there.
Yeah, there has to be. I mean, nobody would willingly put themselves through this if it wasn't real. It certainly isn't something to be done on a whim or lightheartedly.
No, and as much as I like attention, that kind of attention, I mean, I've been very fortunate. When I started transitioning, I probably passed okay before I started hormones. I'm short. My face is somewhat androgynous in its features.
Yeah.
So, like, I was able to pull that off a lot faster than some people probably are. But I remember, like, going into restaurants and things with my family, like, back in February and January, well, before COVID, too. But back in that pre-COVID world where I really, was not passing. And just how tense, because where I am, majority Republican. Majority conservative, and not, I have Republican friends who support my transition. I don't want to make blanket statements like that. That's not fair. But by and large, as a collective entity, the ones who tend to be less supportive of trans rights tend to be more conservative and Republican. And, for sure, where I live, that's pretty dominant. And when I went out, it was tense. It was scary. It was awkward.
Yeah.
You would not do this for fun.
No, no, there's nothing fun about this.
No.
Frankly.
And to be honest, I still love my ex-wife. Like, if I could have, made that work or something, because my dysphoria definitely impacted my sex life and things like that.
Yeah.
I just wasn't, it was uncomfortable and awkward for me.
Yeah.
And that definitely, it wasn't the only thing, but, dysphoria definitely, and my lack of confidence and things like that definitely played into that. Like, I would trade it in a heartbeat to, be able to go back and do something like that. But, like, it's not who I am. Like, I'm not wired that way. This is who I am. I need to embrace it. It's definitely, not something you would choose for yourself.
No, that's a fact. That's a fact. Well, Eva, it was great to chat with you this afternoon. Thanks so much for being here, and for doing what you do. If there's one place trans kids could use some better representation, it's in our schools. I wish you the utmost success, and I hope you'll come back on the podcast sometime in the future.
Absolutely, yeah, I'd love to do that.
I always enjoy chatting with you.
Yeah, I enjoyed it too. Thank you so much.
It's so inspiring to meet someone like Eva. Transitioning is tough business, whatever our career choices, but schools and districts are sort of unique in the amount of local socio-political influence that can exist. Like she said, a school is only as liberal as their most conservative families. And it's such a shame that the negative stigmas about trans people still infect the public narrative, because when you think about it, trans people are ideal school teachers. we see things from multiple points of view. We understand the importance of inclusivity in the classroom. We can empathize with those who are marginalized by society, whether it's race, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, or whatever. Trans people are smart, passionate, fearless, and resilient. Sounds like ideal qualities for a school teacher to me. With regard to the trans athlete debate, as with so many things, I initially found myself succumbing to society's narrative that a trans girl who had had testosterone in her body, even if she was on T-blockers now, would still have an unfair biological advantage over her cisgender peers in terms of physical size, strength, and stamina. Then, while watching WNBA basketball, which is one of my favorite sports leagues, it hit me like a brick. There are plenty of big, tall, cisgender women out there who undoubtedly were the biggest and strongest girls in their schools. I mean, there's no doubt that WNBA superstars like Candace Parker and Brittany Griner had biological, physical advantages over the other girls in their schools. And if we're going to exclude trans girls for their biological advantage, then where does it end? Are we to start imposing limits on height, bone mass, or other naturally occurring biological traits? Will girls' sports become only for the petite? Some girls, both trans and cisgender, are born with biological advantages when it comes to playing sports. That's an irrefutable fact. So then we must ask, why are trans girls being singled out and not the larger cisgender girls who have the same sorts of physical and athletic advantages? That's when it became clear to me that this is a political issue and not something steeped in reality. It's just another way to exploit trans people for political gain. Sure, I've read the blogs. Some poor cis girl became disgruntled because a trans girl whooped her ass at wrestling or something. The narrative headline becomes, "Girls are now forced to compete against boys who think they're girls." Yeah. It always comes down to the same thing. Far too many people still believe that trans women are not women, but rather men pretending to be women. I think gender dysphoria is something that is difficult to grasp if you've never felt it. And people still confuse gender identity with sexual orientation, which is one reason it's such an uncomfortable topic for so many, and therefore closed to discussion. I mean, it's pretty hard to talk gender identity with someone who refuses to see beyond vaginas and penises. I will concede, though, that testosterone is like a performance-enhancing drug. If a line must be drawn, that's probably where it should be. I mean, if steroids are not allowed in girls' sports, then probably neither should testosterone be. That being said, trans girls who get on T-blockers early and forgo the effects of male puberty should be 100% allowed to compete with and against cisgender girls. No questions asked. A simple blood test can measure T levels, and verification could be easily provided. Partitions could be installed in locker rooms if privacy is your main concern. I can't speak for all trans girls, but the last thing I would ever want to do is undress or shower in a group situation where everybody could see and laugh at my shriveled up little raisin of a penis. Perhaps one day, we as a society will evolve and reach the point where genitalia is not such a taboo or the only indicator of gender. But frankly, I think that day is still very distant in our future. In the meanwhile, we trans folks will continue to jump through unnecessary hoops and endure society's doubts and derisions to live authentically. It's what we do. Thanks so much for listening and supporting the trans community. If you would like to help support the podcast financially, visit our Patreon page at Trans Chat with Christiana and consider becoming a patron of the show. With your support, I can keep growing this podcast to reach its fullest potential. I'm Christiana, and this is Trans Chat, brought to you in part by True Voice Lessons, LLC. Take care, be safe, be you, and be proud.